Hello and welcome to the Japan Politics Podcast. Now, I want to talk about Japan's Prime Minister, Sanae Takaichi, and the fact that she's had a little bit of a humbling, a little bit of a return to earth after sort of an incredible honeymoon period and an incredibly strong start to life as Prime Minister of Japan. So basically, as I say, Japan's Prime Minister Sanae Takaichi had a sort of a very narrow contest against her rival Koizumi, who most people expected to win. She managed to pull out a narrow win, and ever since then, she did incredibly well. And for the initial part of her reign, she had sort of incredible poll ratings, up in the 60s, the 70s, and that was going so well for her that after a few months, she decided to call a general election, and that went incredibly well. It proved that her poll ratings were sort of ground out and that there was a real appetite for Sanae Takaichi. People liked her. Also that there was a sort of an appetite for her sort of brand of conservatism. So she did incredibly well. And not only did she regain the LDP's majority in the lower house, she got the biggest electoral victory on record in post-World War II Japan. So just an incredible start. She seemed to sort of had, as I say, the Midas touch after this very narrow win over Koizumi. But recently, I think things, like I say, they've sort of gone down a bit more to sort of average for her, or a little bit rebounded from sort of this incredible honeymoon period. Firstly, because this incredible high poll rating, 60s, 70s, I have read reports in the last month that it's come down a little bit. For example, there was one story I read in the Japan Times, 18th of June, that her poll rating, as I say, she was regularly getting 60s, 70s. It's gone down to 54.3% approval rating. So that's down a little bit. Now, why has that come down? Well, she's had a bit of a scandal, basically, relating to a sort of a video scandal. Basically, someone within her campaign is meant to have met with someone else, and then that person allegedly has gone on to sort of be involved with circulation of sort of AI videos, sort of undermining and being critical of Sanae Takaichi's rivals. And so you could say that's, not a particularly good look. It's misleading, it's underhanded. And so that's led to sort of, a diminishing of perception and sort of negative news stories. Some of the rival parties have come out against this and said, it's not there should be more transparency. Some people have even said maybe there should be legal consequences for this. That's sort of been floating out there, and that maybe she misled the public. But certainly, at the very least, there's been a call for accountability, and there's even discussion of sort of whether there could be reforms could make their way through the lower house in Japan that could sort of lead to greater scrutiny of this sort of thing in the future. So that's been a sort of a negative news story that's out there for her. Also, I think her poll ratings probably relate to the fact that she was seen as sort of a change candidate, very much Sanae Takaichi, a sort of a departure, like compared to the previous couple of prime ministers Japan has had, and obviously the first female prime minister of Japan. And so she represented something new. I think a lot of people identified with that and wanted sort of change. But many of the problems that she was elected to fix, things like the energy crisis in Japan, inflation, cost of living crisis, the rice crisis, many of those problems are still ongoing to some extent. And so because she hasn't fixed it immediately in the first few months of office, it's now gone from a case of she's the person we're projecting our hopes into, we're hoping she can fix these problems, to now she sort of has sort of ownership of those problems because she's been at the helm for a few months. So you could see it as either she's lost popularity, or maybe sort of you could maybe say that initial incredible popularity was maybe not sustainable. Maybe this sort of people generally do like her, but maybe this is more of a return to earth and sort of just what happens to every prime minister once they get ownerships of the problems the country's facing, and unless they do miraculous things and fix all the problems immediately. So it'd be interesting to see going forward if she sort of rebounds from where she was in these stories that were coming out in around June, and if she's able to regain her popularity for a few measures, or if that's maybe sort of the new normal for her. We'll have to wait and see sort of over a longer term where she sits with that. I'd also like to take a sort of a brief look at some of the measures, because she's basically keeping her head down, it looks like, Sanae Takaichi, and trying to put legislation through the lower house in Japan before the summer recess. And so there's a few things she looks to be pushing through. So I'm focusing on a few interesting ones. One interesting one is that she's looking to reduce the size of parliament in Japan. Now, that's quite interesting because this is sort of happening at the behest of her coalition partner, Ishin. And so it's interesting that she's even continuing with Ishin at all, because, as I say, she won such a big victory and like the biggest victory post World War II, which she doesn't really necessarily have to carry on with Ishin. She's got a healthy majority on her own. So it's interesting she's choosing to do that. I suppose there's sort of a bit of a tradition of the LDP doing that because they worked with Komeito for many years when they didn't necessarily have to at times. I suppose there are advantages. It makes them look more conciliatory, that they've got a big tent, that they're able to work with other people. It gives them like a partner sort of bounce idea off, get support. And it's always nice to have obviously extra votes, extra ideas, extra support in Parliament, and to be able to say you're doing things sort of as, in partnership rather than striking out on your own. Maybe makes you look, like I say, more of a team builder. And also there's the added element, of course, that often, it gives you someone to share the blame with whenever something goes wrong. And often it's in coalitions, often it is the junior coalition partner that suffers. So maybe there's an element of that. But in any case, she is working with them to push this bill through that would reduce the size of Parliament, I think, by around 10%. I suppose that basically she's doing that for Ishin, but there's maybe some possible advantages for the LDP, because I think Ishin are doing it partly because it makes them look like reformers, like they're cleaning up Parliament. They're sort of you're acting against the interests of the lawmakers and the political class by reducing them, reducing the amount of taxpayer money that's going directly to the political class, the amount of politicians. And so you could say it's maybe sort of a populist move, sort of and an anti-establishment move. And so maybe given some of the problems that the LDP have had in the past when it comes to things like the slush fund scandal, maybe that is something that Sanae Takaichi thinks might be good for their image, as well as being something that Ishin wants. Now, there might be negatives of this bill, of course, because you could say maybe it's reducing the amount of representation. It means there's a less direct link between you and your representative if there's fewer of them. Of course, and they have to represent more people. And of course, political parties aren't going to like this, because even if there's some theories that this move might benefit larger parties more than small ones, even if that is true, even larger parties won't like this, because 10%, that means there's going to be a number of your colleagues that are going to be sort of leaving and being cut out of Parliament. And so there's going to be you would imagine, some resistance to this from other parties to this being pushed through. So it'd be interesting to see if she's able to get that through okay, and sort of where that goes. Another interesting bill that's going through is the royal family reform that's being proposed by the LDP. Now, this is very interesting, and it's an issue that's been going along for some time. Effectively, I think there are only 2 or 3 male direct members of the imperial royal family, and there's been, as I say, for decades, a sort of fears about the succession of the royal family, because the crown prince of Japan, for a long time, he didn't have a son. This is the heir to the chrysanthemum throne, and then finally he did have a son. And because Japan's inheritance is through male succession only, it looked like there weren't going to be any new male heirs. And so there were fears that they would have to be sort of reform, or possibly even the ending of the royal family if reforms weren't made. And so there was a very serious debate at the time, a sort of years ago, about the very real possibility of broadening the franchise, maybe adapting back old members of the imperial royal family, or maybe making females eligible for succession. Before, as I say, the crown prince did have a son, who now I think is around sort of 18, 19, around there. He's quite young. But the state of play is that although he's the eventual successor and he is very young, after him, there's no likely male heirs. And so there's an incredible amount of pressure on him. And of course, that means, and as I say, there's just a general lack of male heirs in the family, even with, as I say, this quite young eventual heir. And so that's sort of a little bit of a unstable situation that people are worried about. And so the way the reform looks to address this is in a couple of ways. There's a little bit of a compromise offered to the modernizers, because some people want to modernize the royal family and allow females to potentially be eligible for succession. And I think some of the female members of the royal family, they're more well known. They're part of the inner royal family, and I think they're quite liked by many people, as well as I say, generally being part of this inner royal family, so they'll be known to the public in general. So there's maybe some people who think maybe they should just be eligible for succession and broaden it that way. That hasn't happened. It's very much sticking to this long tradition of male-only succession. But what has been offered is that female members of the direct royal family will be able to stay in the family even if they marry a commoner. So they'll be able to sort of stay within the royal family, carry on with their duties, I think, possibly. And as I say, just retain that royal status, even if their children won't necessarily be royals. So that's a little bit of a modernization, a compromise, as I say, to keep them in the royal family. The other thing that's maybe traditionalists will like more is, obviously, as I've mentioned, it's going to stick with the many hundreds of years old tradition of male-only succession. And also, What's being proposed is that male members of the family will be allowed to adopt in a sort of broader, more distant relatives from the royal family and make them part of the succession. That's something that potentially could happen if this reform goes through. Because back in the sort of post World War II reforms, although, as I say, there's not many direct male successors into the Japanese royal family, if you go back far enough, there are sort of extended family who are sort of male to male descendants who could potentially be eligible but were cut out because of the post World War II reforms. They could now be adopted and brought back in. If this happens, this will obviously immediately introduce a lot of people into succession potentially and secure the royal family and sort of reduce that fear that it could sort of go extinct in the male line and sort of the crisis of the royal family ending. However, it presents sort of this very interesting prospect of these sort of relatively unknowns suddenly being added back in. And that's maybe sort of controversial because, as I say, people don't know who they are. They're certainly less known than sort of the direct female descendants who sort of some modernizers would maybe prefer them to be added into the succession line instead of this. So it'd be very interesting to see how that's handled. Obviously, that's going to keep sort of the conservative people like, I think, Sanae Takaichi is a sort of a traditionalist in that sense. Sort of conservatives like this because it preserves the male tradition of succession. But it's going to present a number of interesting sort of moments and challenges. Like, how are they going to handle the process of adopting these people? Is there going to be like a big thoroughfare where there's lots of PR and you introduce these sort of distant royal family members and sort of try to make them more well known to the public? Will there be like a big PR media campaign in that respect? If they are adopted, will they become sort of part of the inner royal family? Will they be given duties? Will they be sort of sent out to sort of get to know the Japanese public and sort of take on a role in that respect? Will they be treated as sort of important ceremonial members of the royal family? And we, like, as I say, it's interesting to see how this prospect of these people who are technically part of the royal family extended being added back in, adopted, how will they treat these relative unknowns, and how will they handle that sudden rush of incredible celebrity and prominence that they'll suddenly get? Although, of course, it would, as I say, secure the royal family. So if this does go through, it's going to be very interesting to see that play out if you're interested in the royal family in a number of ways. And certainly it's the biggest change to the royal family status if this does go through since World War II, and it's got a lot of interesting permutations, so be very interesting to look at that one in the long term. And finally, there's another bill that's maybe a sort of a little bit of red meat being offered up to conservatives. Maybe Sanae Takaichi thinks that could sort of shore up her support, which is she's proposing a flag bill where essentially there's currently no punishment if you take part in sort of a protest or make a statement by burning the Japanese flag. Now, I don't believe this happens very often, so it's maybe more of a symbolic thing, a sort of, patriotic. We're sort of it's something that's being offered up to say that we have pride in the flag and we don't think you should be able to flaunt it in this way without punishment, even if it doesn't happen very often. It's sort of making a statement in that respect. Although you could also make the argument that maybe it's sort of diminishing right to protest and freedom of speech and all that sort of thing. And I believe a number of academics have signed a letter saying they're against this and they have concerns about this flag bill going through. So that's something that's contentious, but as I say, it's like something that for a relatively little cost, you'd think is sort of maybe something that would make conservatives happy, and sort of core supporters of the LDP might be in favour of that. So it'd be quite interesting to look at that going through, even though perhaps it is controversial among sort of people who have concerns about the freedom of speech element. I suppose you could also argue that maybe, given it's largely a symbolic thing, maybe detractors from Sanae Takaichi could say, oh, maybe you should be focusing on sort of more pressing matters and problems facing Japan. But as I say, it'll be interesting to see how contentious that alongside these other bills is and how easy it goes through as sort of we're approaching as the aim is to get lots of this through the summer recess. But yeah, hopefully that gives you sort of a brief snapshot of where Sanae Takaichi is. And it'll be interesting to see if she carries on with sort of business as normal and getting this legislation through. If, as I say, she's able to get through this and sort of increase her poll ratings, or if she's still this sort of 50 plus percent approval could be the new normal for her. But hopefully that gives you a bit of an overview of sort of some of the things she's facing, some of the legislation she's getting through, and sort of a little bit of a snapshot of what's going in Japan at the moment. But yeah, this has been the Japanese Politics Podcast. Thank you so much for listening, everyone. Sayonara, goodbye.